Human bodies have three types of muscles: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscles are attached to bones and allow voluntary movement of the body. It is comprised of very long cylindrical multinucleated cells that are striated and unbranched. It doesn't have gap junctions or intercalated discs, and its calcium sensor in the contraction mechanism is troponin. Cardiac muscle is involuntary and found only in the heart. It is comprised of cylindrical uninucleated cells that are striated and branched. The cells are electrically connected by gap junctions and intercalated discs, and they can generate action potentials without neural input. Its calcium sensor is also troponin. Smooth muscle is mainly found in the walls of hollow organs and is involuntary. Smooth muscle is comprised of spindle-shaped uninucleated cells that are non-striated nor branched. They contain gap junctions but no intercalated disc, and their calcium sensor is calmodulin. Skeletal muscles are attached to bones through tendons. Each muscle is wrapped in a sheath of dense irregular connective tissue called the epimysium. And inside each skeletal muscle fibers are organized into bundles called fascicles, which are surrounded by a middle layer of connective tissue called the perimysium. Inside each fascicle, each muscle fiber is encased in a thin layer of connective tissue called the endomysium. And each muscle fiber is itself a bundle of smaller myofibrils, which is surrounded by sarcolemma and arranged in functional unit known as sarcomere. The myofibrils are composed of two kinds of myofilaments. Thin filaments consist of two strands of actin and one strand of regulatory protein, and thick filaments are staggered arrays of myosin molecules. A sarcomere is defined as the region of myofibril contained between two cytoskeletal structures called the Z-lines. And the striated appearance of skeletal muscle fibers is due to the arrangement of thick and thin myofilaments within each sarcomere. The dark striated A-band is composed of thick filaments containing myosin, which spans the center of the sarcomere. The thick filaments are anchored at the middle of the sarcomere known as the M-line. The lighter I-band regions contain thin actin filaments. According to the sliding filament model, filaments slide past each other longitudinally, producing more overlap between thin and thick filament during muscle contraction, which doesn't change the length of filaments. As mentioned earlier, the thin filaments consist of two strands of actin and one strand of regulatory protein. The actin contains a myosin binding site, which can bind myosin head during muscle contraction. The regulatory protein is known as tropomyosin, which contains the troponin complex that can bind calcium ions. In a muscle fiber at rest, tropomyosin covers the myosin binding sites along the thin filament, preventing actin and myosin from interacting. However, during muscle contraction, calcium ion binds the troponin complex, causing tropomyosin to shift position and expose the myosin binding sites. A series of events lead to the contraction of skeletal muscles. First, the motor neuron releases acetylcholine, which diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to the receptor proteins on muscle fiber's plasma membrane, triggering an action potential in muscle fiber, which is propagated along plasma membrane and down T-tubules. Action potential triggers calcium release from sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a specialized smooth endoplasmic reticulum found in muscle cells. The calcium ions then bind to troponin in thin filament, and the tropomyosin shifts, exposing the myosin binding site. The myosin head is first bound to ATP and is in its low energy configuration. The myosin head then hydrolyzes ATP to ADP and phosphate and is now in its high energy configuration. The myosin head binds to actin, forming a cross bridge. When the cross bridge releases ADP and phosphate, myosin returns to its low energy configuration, sliding the thin filament, which is known as the power stroke. Cycles of myosin cross-bridge formation and breakdown coupled with ATP hydrolysis slide thin filament towards center of sarcomere. This process is known as muscle contraction. Towards the end of muscle contraction, cytosolic calcium ion is removed by active transport into sarcoplasmic reticulum after action potential ends. Tropomyosin blockage of myosin binding sites is restored. Contraction ends and muscle fiber relaxes. Contraction of a whole muscle is graded. The extent and strength of its contraction can be voluntarily altered by two main mechanisms, either by varying the number of fibers that contract or by varying the rate at which fibers are stimulated. Each muscle fiber is innervated by one motor neuron. However, each motor neuron may synapse with multiple muscle fibers. A motor unit consists of a single motor neuron and all muscle fibers that it controls. A twitch results from a single action potential in a motor neuron. More rapidly delivered action potentials produce a graded contraction by summation. Tetanus is a state of smooth and sustained contraction produced when motor neurons deliver a volley of action potentials. There are two main types of skeletal muscle fibers. Slow twitch fibers contract more slowly, but sustain longer contractions. They are all oxidative, whereas fast twitch fibers contract more rapidly, but sustain shorter contractions. They can be either glycolytic or oxidative. Most skeletal muscles contain both slow twitch and fast twitch muscles in varying ratios. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is a neuromuscular disease that results in the progressive loss of motor neurons that control voluntary muscles. Early symptoms include stiff muscles, muscle twitches, and gradual increasing weakness and muscle wasting. Myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disease, which results from antibodies that block or destroy nicotinic acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction, which prevents nerve impulses from triggering muscle contractions, resulting in varying degrees of skeletal muscle weakness. The most commonly affected muscles are those of eyes, face, and swallowing.